Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending the afternoon with us. My name is Amir Jafri. I am the Chief Technology Officer at eBECS. I've been at eBECS for about 6 months, and I am responsible for the overall technology strategy, including the design and development of our cloud services. I'm also responsible for our IP and our template approach moving forward. Prior to eBECS, I spent just over 10 years at Microsoft, all on the Dynamics R&D team. I was one of the platform leads for Dynamics CRM and one of the early architects for Dynamics CRM Online. For the last 3.5 years, I spent my time in Europe as the lead solution architect for Dynamics CRM across EMEA and APJ, working with the largest customers in those regions, ensuring successful deployments. What I'd like to do today is give you a bit of a crash course on the cloud, talk about how to think about the cloud, talk about Microsoft Azure, give you a bit of a high level overview of our cloud services, and then spend a bit of time on understanding how you should be looking at moving your business forward. So when it comes to the cloud, I thought it'd be really effective to think about how the analysts think about the space. So I picked out some quotes from the key analysts in this area would be Forrester, Gartner, and IDC. Now, a quote I really like is by Liz Herbert, and she talks about the cloud's a given, and it's not about whether you should move, it's how you should move it. And I think the word how is key here. It's not just about moving stuff to the cloud and sort of blindly saying, okay, I have these on-premises resources, I'm going to move them to the cloud. It's more about what is the most intelligent and efficient way of moving these resources, and not just moving, it's about how do I leverage what the cloud has to offer. So three high-level categories which businesses are primarily looking at when they think of the cloud. And the first is on efficiency, right? The cloud is essentially cheaper with economies of scale. Stuff like storage, compute is a lot more inexpensive. Storage, for example, is 4 times cheaper than on-premises. So that's an easy one. The other one is enabling innovation. As you have critical applications, do you want to take on the maintenance and the run cost of running them on premises, or do you move them to the cloud? So the majority of CEOs believe that they should be in the cloud. So increasing revenue with existing assets, really. And the last one, which is really critical, is how do you transform your business? So what does the cloud bring you, which allows you to service different scenarios for your customers and your users, which you couldn't do before, given the constraints of the applications and the cloud itself. Now, eBECS being a Microsoft-centric company, we've invested a lot with Microsoft Azure. I'm going to give you a bit of an update on in the momentum behind Azure. So Azure is growing at an incredible rate. And I heard recently that there was essentially a release on average every 6 minutes or so. Um, so there are some amazing numbers here: 5 trillion storage transactions per month. 100,000 new customer subscriptions per month. But the number I find most impressive is 425 million users on Azure. So there are 425 million people with business accounts on Azure who are essentially running their business applications off that. So an absolutely incredible amount. It's also really important to understand what Azure actually is, because I think people talk about the cloud in the abstract a lot. So I want to give you a bit of a very high level overview of what Azure represents. So, at the base level, it's Azure runs in a series of data centers worldwide. Now, the Microsoft Azure blueprint is way more significant than the other players in the market. So, from a regional coverage perspective, there's 24 regions, and 19 of them are currently online. The rest are coming online. And this is your classic data center infrastructure, the actual physical tin, the networking, so on and so forth. Now, the services Azure provides over them are in three sort of classic categories, right? And I'd call this classic infrastructure slash hosting provider services. Compute, like virtual machines, containers. You have your classic storage, file shares, premium, and you have your basic networking, right? Which is how do I network with my data center? How do I maybe connect outside here and there? But generally, I want to stay contained there. So these are what I would call classic hosting provider-ish services. If you're working with current hosting providers, you get at least a reasonable subset of these, particularly on compute and storage, right? Now, where it gets really interesting for us, and I think really complicated for our customers, are the platform services and then the surround services. So on platform, there are compute services. So you can, for example, get Dynamics as a service, which we deliver. We'll talk about that, right? And you can have remote apps then as well. There's integration services, media, developer. There's analytics services where you can actually use machine learning as a service and say, connect to my data, provide me some insight based on that, right? Or IoT services like event hubs and stream analytics, which we've used recently for a customer to essentially process all the events in their business and provide them real-time dashboards, right? Now, on the left side, security and management, that's fairly obvious. It's something, from an IT background, we all understand it, we all need. What's really interesting is the hybrid operations space, which is an area of incredible strength for Microsoft. Now, Microsoft provides a lot of tooling and a lot of services specifically aimed at allowing customers who are on premises to leverage Azure functionality as if it was native, right? So how do I put my backups on Azure in the same using the same tooling and methods I would put my backups on a local system? What does that look and feel like? How do I do import export? How do I use Azure as a as for my site recovery, which we'll cover in a second as well from a eBECS perspective, and what does that really mean, right? And then how do I federate my identity across as well? So very much around, how do I bring someone on premises onto Azure in the most intelligent possible way? So I hope that gives you a bit of an overview. I mean, it's a bit of an intense chart, an intense diagram, sorry, but it is useful to sort of have these in front of you as you think about how do I move my applications forward, and if I'm moving them forward and I'm able to drive some of my functionality to Azure, what are the other value add services I can build on top of Azure using mobile engagement, machine learning, event hubs, and so on and so forth. Now, let's talk about eBECS Cloud Services and how we think about the Azure space. What we've done is that we've taken a look at this fairly extensive variety of services and broken them down to address some sort of key customer requirements, right? The first requirement is help customers achieve a hybrid cloud. Now, when we think of hybrid cloud, we're very focused on the scenario where a customer has an on-premises deployment and has been running for a while, and they're saying, well, I'm not just going to move everything to Azure today. It doesn't work that way. I'd like to understand, what does it take for me to dip my toe in the ocean? Like, what do I have to do to start leveraging some of the functionality which makes sense from a commercial perspective and from a technical perspective, right? And sort of get me started without having the hassle to understand all the services, how everything works, how the infrastructure works, and so on and so forth. The second one is help them replicate key on-premises workloads in Azure, particularly workloads which drive your business. So we'll talk about how we run Dynamics in Azure in a second, but any workload which requires significant compute or significant amount of storage or power when you need it is key in Azure. So one of the critical problems we have with business deployments is, when you start the project, you don't know exactly what you want until you know you want it. And the way the procurement works for most of us is, when you buy tin, you buy the tin you need, you deploy it based on some guesstimates on what you think you may need in year 2 and year 3. And essentially up till then, the servers may or may not be as busy as needed. So you don't really give yourself an opportunity to learn what the business actually needs. You just guess what it hopes, and you tend to overestimate what it needs to almost de-risk yourself. And this is where a flexible platform like Azure comes into play. The last one is simplicity. So it's not just about throwing stuff on Azure saying, great, it's running there. It's really about how do you transform the business without having multiple point solutions and multiple people involved. One of the key aspects for us as well for all our cloud services is that we provide a managed services platform. So we handle all the platform for all the services we provide, and we ensure that everything is running successfully, applications and platforms. We ensure that the backups are viable. We ensure that when you engage with eBECS, the service you provide is actually a service, not a toolkit we expect you to sort of work on yourself. So I'll cover 4 sort of key offerings and the variations within them. These aren't all the offerings we have, but they're the primary ones which our customers tend to sort of adopt. So the first one is Dynamics as a service, which is purely about how do I run my Dynamics ERP, which is AX or NAV, or my Dynamics CRM application in Azure, and what does that really mean, right? Then second one is on recovery, which is I have an on-premises business application running. How do I protect it? Do I need a secondary site? And if I have a secondary site, A, it's expensive, and B, how do I know my data is safe? How can I validate my backup is actually safe? The third one is purely focused on backing up on data. Right? So if I'm creating a backup, and if I have a requirement to back up in a remote place or remote places, and B, I want it as inexpensive as possible, what do I do there? And the last one is about migration, very much a lift and shift, which covers a whole slew of workloads and applications. Really, any application that runs on tin and you are virtualized, and you can actually decide, I'd like to move all these applications into Azure. What does that process really look like and feel like for me? So the first one we cover is Dynamics as a Service, which is our sort of most popular service and is highly adopted there. So we offer two kinds of services there. One is we offer customers a pre-production environments of Dynamics CRM, AX, and NAV. And the idea behind these environments is that we essentially want to get you started as soon as possible, right? And just say, great, you have the environment, you can start developing, testing, evangelizing, building, and so on and so forth. And the second category is actual production environments, where we offer you a production grade environment, including high availability and 99.9% uptime. So when you talk about pre-production environments, we think of them as on-demand environments. So the idea is we have a gallery of images, and we say, well, for a typical Dynamics AX deployment, this is what a pre-production environment looks like. For a typical CRM and NAV, this is what the environment looks like, and we can just provision it. For the environment, we can also give you access to on-premises resources via VPNs. So if your testing and development needs access to your product catalog sitting in a different system, you can absolutely access that as well. Now, we've created these gallery of images and templates based on our experience over the last 15 years in this space. So we have a very good sense of when you do development and when you do testing and you do UAT and training, what do you really need from your system? Now, we typically deploy multiple instances of this because customers don't just say, give me one dev instance and see you later. I know we appreciate that it's a lot more structured than that. And as an example, for Dynamics AX, for the 3 instances we supply for development, testing, and sandbox, it's about £2,500 per month, which is highly cost effective. And most importantly, you only pay for it when you need it. So if you decide you need development environments early on the product lifecycle, and once you've released and you're up and running, you don't need them, we can decommission them. So very much around on demand. You get what you need when you need it. Let us manage it and provision it for you. And when you're done with it, we can disable it. Now, the second category is around production deployments. Now, there's 2 variations of that. There is the purely fully managed IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service deployment, or there's the hybrid deployment. Most of our customers are really in the hybrid deployment space, where they want to be able to connect to on-premises resources, as you can see in the image, like domain controllers, Exchange, and Skype for Business servers there, not Link, and essentially run their Dynamics installation on Azure. Now, one of the most important things, as I covered early on, is that you're able to scale the infrastructure on demand. So there isn't that issue of the day one when you start, you must essentially have a crystal ball or be a magician to figure out what exact resources do you need 2 or 3 years down the line or when you go live. The fact that we can scale resources online allow us to be a little more flexible, a little more pragmatic about how we manage costs from year 1 all the way to year 5. Now, again, we can access on-premises resources, and again, we provide a series of blueprints, tier 1 through tier 4, which I'll document in the next section. And to help you sort of get started, they really are also meant to give you indicative price of how much does it cost for any of these applications, typically for that kind of user, with full high availability as well. You can also pick your own license. If you have your SQL license, you can use them. If you have your AX license, you can use them as well and manage them that way. You can also extend these further with high availability and backup services if you decide you'd like to create backup copies of these in other Azure data centers as well, and we can happily support that too. Now, a bit more detail behind production deployments. We've designed 4 tiers, tier 1 through 4, which are focused on a number of concurrent users and a typical customer in that sort of range as well. Now, the word concurrent is extremely important because it's not named users. So if you have a system with 10% concurrency, 50 concurrent users basically means 500 named users, and so on and so forth. Now, the systems are all 4 tiers are designed for high availability. So what we've basically done is we've reviewed the Microsoft best practices on essentially building a high available system, and we've essentially built it in a way that we are able to pass on Microsoft's uptime SLA to you. So we have mirrored SQL servers, we have multiple AOS servers, for example, for AX, multiple reporting servers as well. I believe redundancy in each tier, which A gives us multiple systems to work with, and B, quite importantly, as Microsoft has critical updates and critical patches which forces reboots of systems, you are still guaranteed the 99.9% uptime you would expect. Now, these systems are also available 24/7. So just to sort of sum it up a little, what we do is we provide fully managed Dynamics AX, CM, and NAV deployments for production and for pre-production. What we basically do is we will do the performance infrastructure assessment and say, well, you're probably a tier 1 customer, maybe some variations in there. We'll deploy the platform and the applications for you. We'll also maintain it over time. We'll monitor the application, monitor the system itself. Can also provide you status reports, including identification of any concerns. We had a customer recently who were about to exceed their storage because of backups, and we were able to catch that early on. Now, we're also able to keep your deployment up to date with the latest patches. Just to be clear, we're talking about platform patches, not application patches, because application patches will change the behavior of the application, and we would partner with you when we actually do that. And obviously, you can provision additional environments within the SLA as well. The graphic at the bottom is really important because as you work through your project lifecycle, your needs change. Initially, you're starting with multiple dev systems and maybe a test system, maybe some others. When you're close to deployment, you have a test and UAT, which are critical systems. When you go live, you have a prod and maybe a UAT system somewhere. And then you sort of start the cycle again. So what we don't want you to do is have to deploy all of these systems on day one and maintain them over time. You should really be using what you need when you need it and only paying for that as well. So let's talk about the next category of services, which is on recovery. Now, most customers in the mid-market and upper space really have fairly stringent or fairly serious requirements around high availability and disaster recovery. For local high availability, there's fairly well understood design patterns around replication of data, around SQL, around creating multiple web tiers, around creating multiple domain controllers, and all of that stuff. Now, for customers looking to actually protect their site from a site failure, this is where typically they need to provision a secondary site in a remote location. Now, secondary sites are expensive to run and maintain, obviously, and you're not really using them either. So, there's quite a significant capital expenditure on having a secondary site. What we've tried to address with these family of services is a scenario of how do we provide you a secondary site in a cost-effective manner, and what variations of solutions can we give you based on your requirements, so that it's not just a one big bang solution. You can have a gradual uptake as well. So we have two categories of these. First one is application disaster recovery, which is very much around taking your existing on-premises application and blueprint, and extending it into Azure. In case of a disaster, we fail over the entire application to Azure. Azure is basically your fully up and running secondary site. Now, with site disaster recovery, it's slightly different. What we're saying, we can protect any set of resources. It could be a Dynamics family, it could be Active Directory, SQL Server, file share, Linux servers. We can protect basically anything. And what we do is, in case of site failure, we take all these services and we bring them up in Azure as a secondary site. So bring up basically everything. It's dormant and we just hydrate it. Application disaster recovery, in principle, we're stretching the customer side into Azure. We extend it essentially by using Azure IaaS, and I'll give you an example of that. But the most important thing here is that it requires minimal changes to your existing deployment. So if you are currently running Dynamics AX, Dynamics CRM, and you'd like to use Azure as a secondary site, you don't have to rebuild, redeploy anything. We can just make some changes essentially at, while you're up and running. Now, because you have a secondary site in Azure and you have your data in Azure as well, you can leverage it for BI, for example, which saves the impact of production there. And in case of disaster, we fail over. Now, what we do is we set up a secondary site for you, we monitor it, we patch it, we maintain it. We also do a quarterly test failover and failback exercise to make sure that your site's actually valid. It's great having a secondary site, but you also need to understand that it's working. And of course, if there is a failure, we will help you perform the production failovers. So what it looks like visually is that on your left, you have your primary site, you have your standard sort of machines, your AD DNS servers, your Dynamics web servers, your SQL Server database, most likely replicated for local high availability. And what we do is we contain it, we set up a container for you in Azure. In that container, we connect it with your primary site using the virtual private network. So anything we put in the container now is accessible via your primary site within the constraints you define, of course. Then what we do is we create a mirror of functionality. Now, typically these servers aren't as powerful. They have smaller compute profiles than the ones in production because they are a secondary site. But we have them there so that we can essentially replicate key information, whether it's Active Directory or whether it's actual data using SQL always on replication from the primary site to Azure. Now, in this scenario, if there is a failure in the primary site, the Azure site is completely self-sufficient and it'll just be up and running. And because we have real-time replication between the systems, asynchronous replication between the systems, then you don't essentially lose any data unless it's in transit. Now, the other the service we offer is site disaster recovery. And site disaster recovery has a much wider remit. It's able to protect a really wide variety of applications and really any resource which runs on a Windows, Hyper-V, VMware, physical, really any kind of hardware we can protect. Right? You can include just critical applications. You can include the entire site. It's a highly, highly cost-effective solution. And in case of a failure, we basically bring up the secondary site. So what we actually do is we do an assessment to understand what your recovery set is, which is basically the set of applications you want to protect. We deploy and configure the recovery vault in Azure. We make sure that the replication is maintained. And most importantly, we do validate that the backups you have work. In principle, how it works is that when you select the resource you want to protect, we create a backup of them in Azure, essentially sitting in blob storage. And we keep them in sync at a regular interval. Now, in case there is a failure, we basically we create a new Azure site and hydrate the virtual machines based on the data in the blobs. And obviously, if you want to fail back, we'll support that experience as well. So visually, the way it works is that this is a classic scenario today where you have a primary site and secondary site. And what we're saying is instead of having a secondary site run all the time, basically allow us to store the backups of your resources on the left side in Azure, in blob storage, and only when you need a site failover, spin them up. So essentially, you're not paying for something you're not using. So if there is a site disaster, we'll spin them up, and we'll spin them up as virtual machines and storage and other resources in Azure itself. And now your secondary site is up and running. Now, because these services are all going after the similar scenario, we wanted to talk about which service is actually right for you. So, application disaster recovery is really suited for web applications with critical data, typically business applications like Dynamics AX, CRM, NAV, and SharePoint, of course. Now, the two measures of a HA and DR application are RPO and RTO, We stand for recovery point objective and recovery time objective. Recovery point objective is how much data can I afford to lose, and recovery time objective is how soon am I up. So for application disaster recovery, there is no loss of committed data unless there's data in transit between the local and remote sites. So in that sense, it's a premium solution. Now the RTO is also minimal because the failover can be done within a few minutes, but it depends on your SLA, of course, and your other processes around your applications, because the data is already on the secondary side, and the secondary side is already generally active. Now, site disaster recovery, as I mentioned, is a little different. It's suited for a wider variety of applications. The RPO is about 30 seconds or so, which is a minimal sync frequency. So essentially, we maintain, we save the changes on your protected instances every 30 seconds or so, right? Now, the RTO is variable, and this is because, as I mentioned earlier, we save a copy of these all in Blob storage. If we need to activate them, we spin up new virtual machines and rehydrate them based on the data in the Blob storage, which can take hours, for example. Now, this is a fairly complicated area, which is where the eBECS Cloud Ready Assessment, which I'll talk about soon, will hopefully be able to get you to the right decision. The next thing I wanted to talk about was backup. Now, backing up to the cloud is becoming really prevalent, primarily because of how inexpensive the cloud really is. So, according to Forrester, and this is from last year, I believe, cloud storage is approximately 4 times cheaper than on-premises standard storage. And you take that and you couple that with the fact that your working set is primarily very small and your data is growing exponentially over time, the cost of maintaining that data set, even for archival purposes on premises, is just too high. So what we do for our customers is we basically set up the backup service for you, and we deploy and configure the backup. We set up redundancy options. We make sure that we maintain and monitor backup processes between your site and Azure, and we set up the backup retention models as well. Now, what our goal is to allow you to use whatever backup tooling you currently have, or provide you additional backup tooling to manage the whole process for you, and allow you or ourselves to validate the backups as you would validate any other backups on premises as well. So as I mentioned earlier, Microsoft is doing a lot of work around the hybrid cloud, and this is one of the key areas where it surfaces, where from your perspective, the way we set it up is fairly it's not really visible to you where the data is being stored, and when you interact with your backups, it sort of looks and feels like it's on premises. Now, we can also assist you with the process by validating quarterly test restores, or by performing or facilitating, as I mentioned earlier, database restores within an SLA. Now, the last major service I want to talk about was the cloud migration services. So the migration services are very much around how do I lift and shift my workloads into the cloud. So how do I move complex running workloads? And the running part is also key here. It's not just a workload which I don't use today, or it's not really active. How do I move my running workload into the cloud? And we use Azure Site Recovery for that. And how do I have minimal downtime in my move, which is key as well. What we do in this scenario is we assess your deployment scope. We set up all the stuff we need to on the Microsoft side, including recovery vaults. We maintain the replication between your side and Azure, and we validate the backup by doing a test restore. So we actually make sure that the backup we've created is valid, and then based on a schedule, we do production failover and decommission on-premises applications. This is a bit more detail on what we actually do, but the way to think about this is to sort of step up a level and think about the design principles. So the first thing is reduce downtime for the production system. So as you're migrating, we don't want to have a scenario where migration, because of the size of the application, migration takes 3 weeks, your application is down for 3 weeks, which is, we believe is unacceptable. So the solution we've designed has essentially minimal downtime. The second thing is you want to verify that the workload is migrated or migratable successfully before doing anything. So the way we actually do it is we make a copy of your workloads. We do a test restore into Azure to make sure that the system is usable, everything is valid, and so on and so forth, before we actually do anything. So we'll do a test restore, make sure everything's fine, and only at that point we'll say, great, Then at a certain point in time, we'll do a switch from on-premises to Azure, and we handle all the integration and the networking touch points. So any clients accessing those systems basically don't notice the difference when they come back up in Azure. And that's really the third key, which is simplify the process for our customers and for the users of our customers as well, not just the IT. So it's not that, oh, we've moved to Azure, now everyone must change their configurations. So we've covered the four main categories of service. Dynamics is a service which talks about how do I run my ERP and CRM workloads in the cloud. We've talked about recovery, which is how do I use Azure as my secondary site, and what options do I have if I want a highly available, constantly running secondary site, or if I just want to protect some assets. We've talked about backup and how inexpensive that is, and we've talked about a migration offering which allows you to take existing assets and move them to Azure in the safest possible way. Now we also have another offering which is really important and which can really help you get started on this journey, which is the Cloud Ready Assessment. And the idea really is allow you to investigate and define your strategy before you invest. Like say, well, what does it take for my business to move to the cloud? What does Azure bring? What do I need to do from an infrastructure perspective to connect to Azure? So as an example, I talked a bit about extending your on-premises infrastructure into Azure and start stretching it to make Azure a logical part of your business, basically. And how do you do that? What does it take? How about impact does it have on network security, Active Directory? What impact does it have on your routers? How do I set up VPNs? How do I administer and control it? And how do I sort of manage it over time, really, right? As part of the offering, we also review your application and workloads to see what needs to move and also what needs to be protected. What level of protection do you need? Do you need just a backup? Do you need just a recovery site in case of site disaster, or do you need a zero data loss secondary site solution as well? And what comes out of it really is planning consideration for Azure. What do you need to do? What does it take for you to get there? And then any suitability from an eBECS Cloud Services perspective. The goal really here is to help you build up a roadmap on how to move the business forward. So, call to action, three things I'd like you to take away from this session. The first thing is learn more about the eBECS Cloud and what we can do for your business. We have a bit more detail on our website, which is linked to over here. You can also talk to your account managers in eBECS or just contact us directly via our website, and we can give you a bit more detail on these and other services which we're investing in. One thing I would really advise all of you to do if you're just looking at the cloud and trying to make the first step is leverage the Cloud Ready Assessment service. There's a 10% discount for people participating on this webinar, so that's a bit of an advantage as well. What it really will do is help you create that roadmap. And lastly, we have a masterclass, two masterclasses, coming up on September 24th in Swindon and September 29th in Chesterfield. And this is where I'll be leading the participants through a day-long workshop where we do a deep dive into the cloud, we do a deep dive into Azure services, how to construct these Azure services, what does it really mean for your business, and what you leave with is a bit of a roadmap on how to move your business forward and identifying the critical areas and workloads where Azure makes sense for you, or critical areas and workloads where Azure may not make sense for you today but make sense for you tomorrow, and how to sort of essentially plan out the roadmap for you. So again, thank you for your time this afternoon, and if you have any further questions, please contact myself or the account team, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.